Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic are the creators of Citaware, the world's #1 C4 ISR software. We've designed C2 systems for the military since 1986 and supply more than 45 countries worldwide. With a heritage built on innovative development and rigorous testing, this is a proven in-service solution based on real customer requirement and tailored to fit your needs.
One of the topics I wanted to get to in this show was nuclear command and control. It's so different from military or conventional political military relationships, processes, and procedures that it deserves some special attention, a dedicated episode. Clearly, the discussion we're going to have now is at the unclassified level. So the expectation today is not to be talking about the detail of connectivity or nodes or miles of cable, nor is it really about the decisions themselves. What I want to do is talk about how and why nuclear C2 is different, why it requires so much dedicated investment, how the credibility of nuclear C2 is a key part of the strategic deterrence capability, and how decisions generically are made in this realm. Is it so different from conventional statecraft and conflict, or is there some crossover? After all, the same people may have the continuity of roles between conventional and nuclear command and control. One of the issues with this topic is that if you talk to military people about it and their political masters, they tend to shy away from it, as if doing so would destroy some form of strategic advantage. It doesn't. In fact, it does the reverse. The more people who understand nuclear command and control, the better equipped the national security audience is in having discussions about everything from deterrence to strategic empathy. So I was pondering who to ask to record a conversation with me for you when I came across some work by a US scholar by the name of Professor Andrew Reddie from Berkeley. Over the past decade, he served in roles at the Sandia National Laboratories, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory Center for Global Security Research, and the Council for Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He's also an alumni of the Hams J. Morgenthau Fellow Program and the Brooke Krulak Center at the Marine Corps University. So, it's a broad set of experiences, right? Andrew, listen, thanks for joining us. I wonder if you could start us off with sort of the basics, really, and the concept of strategic stability.
No problem at all. And also just a really interesting bio point. Despite sounding like a surfer from California, I'm actually from Scotland, Dunfermline, Fife. We moved to America when I was 11, which is why I sound like this. But yes, on the question of strategic stability, I think really we think about it as being comprised of three things, one of which is really very much in the kind of the nuclear domain. So the first constituent piece of strategic stability is crisis stability. So making sure that no one in a conflict has an incentive to escalate the crisis from a particular layer. To some extent, this borrows from Herman Kahn's kind of ladder of escalation, if you will, from the 1960s. And so you want to make sure that you don't move up that escalation ladder, if you will, during a particular conflict. So if something's happening and it's entirely happening in the conventional realm, you want to make sure it stays there and doesn't start moving into the nuclear context. The second constituent piece of strategic stability is arms race stability. And so you want to try to tamp down the incentives to embark upon arms races, particularly given that we think about these competitions as being a race to the bottom. Indeed, there's a lot of conversation right now happening around artificial intelligence or AI integrating into military context, race to the bottom. And so we worry about that as well as states kind of create capability. Now, one of the things to note here when you think about arms race stability and the kind of spiraling behavior that comes from the security dilemma, there's nothing inside of the theory about a spark of a conflict, but you still worry that if you've got two sides to a conflict armed to the teeth, you're increasing the likelihood that you're going to likely have either an inadvertent escalation or indeed an incentive to go when you feel like you have a window of opportunity. And then finally, the third constituent piece, which is really focused on the nuclear domain, and it kind of has two parts. So the first part of strategic stability that we're worried about in the nuclear domain is first strike stability. So do I feel like my nuclear assets are safe such that I can actually use them to deter an adversary? Because nuclear weapons are really kind of interesting and separate, right? They're a capability that you create not necessarily to use them, certainly not in the battlefield context, but really what you're trying to have is have them in your back pocket for deterrence purposes. And so you want to make sure that you're creating the conditions under which nuclear states have that first strike stability and they feel like they have that capability in order to deter. And then related, you also want to have second strike stability. So you want to create the conditions under which if a nuclear state were to actually embark upon a first strike, you want to have a nuclear asset that's safe from that first strike such that you then can fire back. Again, with the idea that that strengthens the nuclear deterrence relationship, tamping down any incentives to actually use the capability. And so obviously one of the major vulnerabilities to second strike stability would be advances in missile defense technology that would tamp down the ability for a nuclear strike to actually hit its target. And so you worry about those two parts, first strike stability, second strike stability. And of course, nuclear command and control has a key role to play in both aspects of those types of stability in the nuclear domain.
So it feels like, in layman's terms, that strategic stability in this domain is about the first strike not paying off. So there is no point in doing a surprise nuclear attack on a state because they can guarantee that even if you did that, the attacker is going to reap the whirlwind, right? That there's an assured return fire capability that is going to be devastating. And there's that predictability of responses and there's sort of human behaviors that sit behind that. But command and control clearly then plays a very important part on the redundancy, your ability to cue that second strike, right? Is that the sort of fundamental element of nuclear C2?
Absolutely. And it's also reflected in the distribution of capabilities that you would have in the nuclear domain as well. So obviously in the US context, we've got the nuclear triad. And so you've got submarine-based forces, bomber forces, and ICBM forces. And each of them is doing a slightly different thing in terms of making sure that you're getting that first and second strike stability goodness out of it. And of course, the challenge for command and control is making sure that you're knitting together the wide variety of different types of assets from the decision maker on down to the submariner, the bomber pilot, the missileer, who's actually going to be the one making a determination about whether to launch. And like I said, you're worried about a second strike phenomenon. So you're also trying to make sure that they're able to engage in a pretty significantly degraded environment given a hypothesized first strike. And so it's a pretty significant problem. And one of the major challenges for command and control, I would say more or less across the board, but really there's no constituency inside the military services for command and control assets per se. So the Air Force is responsible for the bombers and the missileers, right? They're not necessarily always thinking about the network that lies behind it. And so I have to say, like, one of the military leaders that I have a lot of time for is John Hyten, who's now at the Joint Chiefs. And he was in the late 2010s really making the argument that during a period in which the United States was thinking hard about nuclear modernization, that we really think hard about command and control and create a constituency for that network because it is so fundamental and underpins the ability of any part of your triad to operate. And obviously in the United Kingdom's context, that's also the same in terms of making sure that you have uplinks between your submariners and your decision makers. Of course, the United Kingdom has some really interesting fail safes as well. So we can talk about that as well.
We might come to that, but I just want to go back to this conversation, which feels very Cold War, right? It feels as though this was related to great power competition. That was when the nuclear weapons were at their height, despite the fact we had some treaties then. Effectively, it's a free-for-all, and mostly it revolved around the strategic stability between the forces of the Soviet Union and those of the United States. I mean, it was a Russia-US strategic stability that was underpinned by this thing, and they sort of understood each other really well. But after 89, 91, whatever you want to call it, there are a variety of treaties that limited nuclear weapons. I'm assuming their importance has disappeared. Nuclear weapons didn't appear in the post-Cold War period to form a central part of national security. Okay, there was some hat tipping to them. There was some tilting at windmills that went on national security policy. But generally, it was about counterterrorism, rogue states. It was less about it. And now we have this reversion to a great power competition kind of narrative. And so are we just reverting straight back to Cold War doctrine, or have there been evolutions? What sort of happened over that interregnum of 1990, 1989 until, I don't know, whenever you said it changed, 2020?
A lot of things have changed. And indeed, I think to some extent, there's a flavor of what's old is new, certainly. But also the security challenges are perhaps more pernicious now in a world in which certainly in Washington, they look a lot at what Beijing's doing inside of this space. You've got quantitative increases and qualitative broadening of nuclear capabilities in China. And so particularly the US Congress looks very, very carefully at that and is starting to make arguments about what the US nuclear forces need to look like in response to that scenario. I have to say, I'm not necessarily a fan of the idea that you need to increase your numbers to be commensurate with what Russia plus China has. But obviously, you've got all sorts of theorizing around the three body problem and how complex that is to actually think about what strategic stability looks like. Indeed, in a lot of ways, I think the challenges of 2024 through, let's say, 2035 are more significant than those that we faced in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Not helped by the fact that, like you said, our attention turned elsewhere in the 1990s and 2000s towards thinking about counterterrorism, Afghanistan, Iraq adventures, etc. And so what that meant was we had a deterioration in the defense industrial base writ large. I mean, this is true in the United States, but also amongst allies and partners. And what that meant was there was a real hollowing out of the workforce that was thinking hard about the engineering, science challenges, but also the policy challenges associated with nuclear weapons, strategic stability, etc. And this goes all the way through until the mid-2010s. I mean, when I told my doctoral committee that I wanted to work on nuclear weapons, they said, well, you'll never get a job. And so it turns out that obviously the world has kind of turned back in this direction, that we really need to try to understand it. But we do have this hollowing out. And so what you'll find when you look at the defense community and the nuclear community in particular is you'll have a workforce that's getting towards the end of their careers, getting ready for retirement, or potentially being asked to postpone their retirements. And then you have a younger generation, right, who are roughly 35 and under. And then there's kind of very little in between. And that's because there was so little funding for thinking about this issue set over the last 20, 30 years. Of course, that's the kind of the negative story. The positive story is that you've got a whole slew of different technologies that are kind of interesting in the context of nuclear weapon modernization, and then obviously command and control and modernization and what that ends up looking like.
And I want to get to that technology in a second, but I also just wanted to check on the fact that if we're teaching from the last time we had great power competition with nuclear weapons, the Cold War era, we can't just transpose those because they work for Russia. We can't transpose those directly onto China. And then it's not just Russia and China. It's not just a three-body problem. Administrations might not want to say it for a variety of policy reasons, but you've got North Korea, you've got Iran in development. You've also got other actors, Pakistan, India, Israel. Actually, the proliferation has not been massive, but it has been significant. Does the idea of strategic stability play off directly in all those micro relationships, as it were, between India and Pakistan, for example? Do they work on the same basis of strategic stability in nuclear statecraft?
In terms of a policy goal for Washington, and I think also London as well, I think the answer is yes. So you're trying to make sure that India and Pakistan create some of the fail-safe mechanisms that are mirror images. I take the point that you definitely don't want to over-infer from the Cold War use case and say, let's transpose that onto 2024. But the overarching goal is similar. I mean, there are things that countries do that look anathema to their interests that are kind of puzzling. So, for example, the United States will provide technical assistance to Pakistan in order to secure their nuclear weapons within the interest of nuclear safety and making sure they don't fall into the hands of non-state actors, despite the fact that Pakistan lives entirely outside of the nuclear nonproliferation regime. And so you might not expect that they would do that. In terms of adversary to adversary, you also have kind of puzzling behavior. So, for example, one of the things that's written into the very early versions of arms control is effectively an implicit promise amongst the Soviets and the Americans that they won't fiddle in one another's national technical means. Now, what that actually means to a layperson is that I won't shoot your satellite out of the sky that's looking at my capability. And eventually you end up getting arrangements like the Open Skies Treaty because there's an acceptance of the fact that Russia knowing what the Americans are doing and vice versa is actually stabilizing all else equal, particularly with regards to that crisis stability piece of strategic stability that we talked about earlier. And so some of those arrangements are the types of things that some policymakers are looking to institute vis-a-vis Beijing and Washington. But to your point, it's not at all clear that you're actually going to be able to create those types of fail safes, right, or institutional mechanisms that we had previously. There's a large conversation happening right now around hotlines and creating those between the Chinese and the Americans. They actually already exist. The problem is that the Chinese don't always want to answer the phone. So it's not really a technical problem, it's a political problem. And so again, that's a really good example of you're not going to necessarily end up with entirely the same institutional architectures and transpose them forward. And I think another point that's really important to make is that despite the fact that we created this institutional architecture, we still had a large number of near misses, accidents, etc. Eric Schlosser in his book Command and Control does a really good job of kind of spelling those out, right? And so there's no guarantee that as you move architectures from the Cold War period into today, that you're going to end up having 50 to 60 years of relative, let's call it negative peace, right? The lack of a shooting war between great powers. So we certainly do think about it in that way. In terms of dealing with what, Washington would call rogue states, so North Korea and potentially nuclear Iran, really there we look to things like our missile defense capabilities, given the relatively low quantitative numbers in those contexts. Now, of course, both the numbers and then qualitative delivery systems are going to be shifting, particularly in the North Korean case. And you can kind of see this. So once the North Koreans pass the Rubicon in terms of their nuclear capability in the warhead, now they start making advancements on the delivery systems, increasing their range, in all likelihood, increasing their accuracy. And so that's something that the United States, like I said, focuses its missile defense forces on rather than anything else. But it's a moving target. And obviously, one of the things that scholars like me track quite closely are the nuclear posture reviews that come out of the government that kind of are good ways to track what the strategic concerns are and what the capabilities that are being in development are in order to respond to those types of threats.
It's something that sometimes people don't get on this side of the pond is the fact that strategic stability really only applies between the big three, and you hope between Pakistan and India. But actually against smaller states with smaller arsenals, really, it's almost not worth the money to invest in strategic stability conversations and architecture because they are unpredictable. They don't behave in rational ways that we would expect great powers to behave. It's the unpredictability to it which makes this whole theory almost unworkable. And therefore, the investment in a missile shield is not an either or, it's an and, right?
Yeah, but it's an and that has real consequences for both first and second strike stability, because I no longer know that I can actually get to target. I mean, it's really tough. I think you'll know this. I mean, game theory as a discipline emanates in the security context from the Cold War competition. That's why we're so good at modeling two-player games. And so you're making a lot of assumptions when you're thinking about it in game theoretical terms. It's actually one of the reasons that we do a lot of wargaming here at Berkeley to kind of get at some of the human aspects of a crisis. So you don't have to make a lot of these assumptions about rational and irrational behavior. But it's really an open question regarding what the interests are of particular leaders in particular countries and whether we can say that there's a universal instinct towards survival or if it's about something else. I mean, certainly with regards to China, we think it's about regime survival, not necessarily about the body politic in the same way that it would be here in the United States. We are fortunate that no leader has made a decision to launch a nuclear weapon, but certainly you worry when that power is endowed in a single individual. But there's a lie in there as well, because in the United States context, it's also endowed inside of a single individual, which is a conversation that we're all having after November, again, about who it is that ultimately should have the control authorities, right, and the ability to command. And so ultimately, it is going to be a human decision. We can talk about dead hand systems down the road if you'd like, but right now it's a human decision to launch a nuclear attack. And so, we're trying to figure out how to make sure that you have this ability to kind of establish usability and keep everybody inside of the box. In terms of first strike stability concerns as well, there's the big conversation happening around hypersonic weapons. I assume it's happening in the United Kingdom as well. So a lot of concern here in the United States with regards to China, certainly, but potentially even Russia being quote unquote ahead when it comes to hypersonics. I would just note that hypersonics aren't particularly interesting from a speed perspective. They travel Mach 5. an ICBM is going Mach 12 by the time it hits a target. So speed's not really the thing. The thing that's interesting about hypersonics is the maneuverability. If I were sitting in the PLA, the Chinese military, and I were making decisions about what to buy, and I saw the United States spending billions of dollars on missile defense capabilities, I too would be investing in hypersonic capabilities. On the flip side, the United States doesn't face adversaries that are investing a great deal into missile defense. And so really it is a case of you want to build up the capabilities on the basis of net assessment, which is to say that you want to build it on the basis of where you need to make sure that you have an advantage given what your adversaries actually have in the field.
Since we're already sort of halfway down that route to the evolution of technology, in command and control terms, there are a bunch of legacy systems which run our nuclear command and control. And when I talked about miles of cable, genuinely that's what lots of states still rely on, is miles and miles of cable sending very, very low frequency messages that coded correctly give the instructions to release. And then there's all sorts of longhand letters and no broadcast from long wave radio, all sorts of fail safes that go on. Surely, when militaries are transforming, they're creating themselves digitized battle networks. They're talking about joint all-domain command and control systems, coalition all-domain command and control systems, systems of systems, networks, Starlinks of the military, all that sort of. Surely, there is an argument to be made that it's time to move on from extremely low frequency broadcasts et al.
Yeah, so I think there's always going to be a place for some of that, just given that passing signal through salt water at depth is such a significant technical challenge. Now, of course, there's a whole slew of R&D going on in the quantum sensing space that may end up obviating the need for acoustic transponder fields or fiber optic cable being run, right, et cetera. But certainly one of the things that you see in command and control over a long period of time is redundancy after redundancy after redundancy to try to make sure that signals going from decision maker to bomber, missileer, submariner. Submariner is the hardest. So actually the Brits, by virtue of the fact that that's the sole deterrent, they really worry about that set of technical problems. In the American context, because the ICBMs can go early, the bombers can go and then also potentially be called back. The fact that submariners, it can take time to get to the submarine commander it's kind of neither here nor there. But certainly we're having that conversation. And technology is impacting the full stack. I tend to put early warning systems inside of the bucket of nuclear command and control and communications. Some don't. But obviously there's revolutions happening in intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, or ISR technologies to do early warning. So synthetic aperture radar assets deployed on pseudo satellites that are actually inside of the atmosphere or in small sat constellations, multispectral, hyperspectral imaging, all of which are helping us say something hot traveling at a roughly 11 kilometers an hour has launched from a place where we think there might be a nuclear asset. And then, of course, once you're getting to the command and control piece, lots of conversations about what modernization ought to look like. Obviously, there's real things to like about the analog, quote unquote, old way of doing things in terms of it being relatively robust to things like cyber attacks, for example, because it really does run on old technology from the 70s. Indeed, we have to make sure that we have coders that can still work in Fortran for some of these systems. And so you do get that kind of resilience by the virtue of the fact that you're not going to have people poking at those systems. And indeed, they're entirely air gapped, et cetera. Not to say that air gap systems aren't vulnerable. They are cenotons, for example. But you do have that resilience. But really, to your point, there's a lot of conversation about the efficiencies that you're likely to get plugging the nuclear command and control systems into the broader, you mentioned joint all domain like JADC2. It's very real because why deploy an entirely separate set of satellite assets or other types of ISR assets just for the nuclear mission? Of course, the problem, right, or the perceived challenge with that particular scenario is that you've got what James Acton at Carnegie Endowment describes as the entanglement problem, which I think is a really good way of thinking about it, which is if my adversary ends up shooting one of my satellites out of the sky that we think that they ought to know is really doing only nuclear things, how should I perceive that attack? Is that an attack on my nuclear assets? Should I subsequently engage in a nuclear response? There's a lot of ambiguity there. And so if you're using different systems for different things, you're not able to have your adversaries discriminate or indeed discriminate yourselves. And in reality, there's no way to kind of settle this theoretical debate. It's going to come down to, right, how many dollars you want to spend and how separate you want to make sure that these capabilities actually are. We try to push on some of these questions using war games, but ultimately we've got no empirical data, right? There's not examples of, cyber satellites getting shot out of the sky and then looking at a response. And we hope that we never live in a world where that's actually a thing. But I think that ultimately it's going to come down to a dollar's decision or a pound sterling decision in the UK's case about kind of where you want to put these assets. And of course, different countries have different degrees of cooperation and collaboration in this space. Obviously, the United States and the United Kingdom collaborate very closely. Our other NATO ally, France, walks out of the Nuclear Weapons Council at NATO anytime that nuclear weapons come up. So I think that's another piece of the puzzle as well, as you think about the broader ways in which you have to have collaboration between allies and partners, given some of the security threats that are faced in common vis-a-vis, right, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right, a South China Sea contingency or an East China Sea contingency, et cetera.
One of the difficulties here is weighing up, as it is for lots of military procurement decisions, this idea of efficiency versus the idea of resilience and redundancy. And the worry, I think, for a lot of scholars thinking about this is that they conflate or they see procurement and value for money decisions being conflated between nuclear and conventional. And it's the conventional arguments being put on nuclear rather than the understanding of nuclear needing to be separate for a set of statecraft theories to be right. And it's a very difficult decision when budgets are particularly tight. How much do you invest in this? Exactly as you're saying about the nuclear enterprise in states, which was stripped out, threadbare, during the post-Cold War period until recently. They're trying to recreate that again now. And it feels very much the same. It also feels as though we're slightly behind in some of these arguments and discussions about whether to go analog or digital. And because of that, we're just not making decisions, which might or might not be a bad thing, right? But that feels like where we are. Would you say that's roughly on the money?
Yeah, well, it goes back to the fact that you don't have a true constituency for nuclear command and control inside of the military services or the ways in which we organize, right? The Ministry of Defense, Department of Defense, et cetera. There's nobody saying like, this is what I need in terms of dollar spend in order to have best in class nuclear command and control or indeed conventional command and control. And so it's only in the last, what was that, 2018, I think that Hayden got up and made his speech on modernizing NC3. So that's 6 years-ish. And it takes far longer than that to do any types of military procurement. And so very much so. You will hear anecdotal stories of maintainers, or what they're called in the US context of the nuclear enterprise, pilfering scrap yards for not the floppy disks that are the save icon for all of us, but the actual old floppies that look more like a vinyl record. And that's not sustainable, not least because a lot of the companies that built the original networks and architecture no longer exist. And some number of them have been gobbled up by the other large private military firms like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, et cetera. But some number of them have just disappeared right into the ether. And so you have no continuity in terms of making sure that you're able to go back for a part that's really integral to a particular system. And so, there's a lot of Band-Aids that get put on top of these architectures. So, we'll kind of see. I wouldn't want to take it too far, though. I mean, there's a whole slew of projects right now getting funded looking at AI NC3, and I've been guilty of getting some of that money myself in the past. And in reality, there's no real appetite for thinking about how to integrate truly AI tools into nuclear command and control because of all of the problems that are associated with accidents, inadvertent escalation risk, the fact that you're establishing trust between you and a model that may hallucinate ends up being pretty significant. And there's no way to really test these things in a live environment. And by the way, we have no data to actually adjudicate, right, when it is you ought to be escalating. I don't know if you or your viewers have watched the TLDR video from the Future of Life Institute. It's a very good video for making you think hard. The arguments effectively that you'll have automation bias where humans will just accept the recommendations from an AI model and then make decisions to escalate a conflict. But there's no data to feed that model. In political science, in my field, we've got some empirical data sets like correlates of war or the militarized interstate dispute settlement data set. And you would never use that to build an AI model to make determinations about launching a cyber attack or launching a nuclear attack. You just wouldn't do it. And so there's no kind of data to actually use. The ways in which we see automation used in NC3 context looks a lot more like the perimeter or dead hand system.
I want to come to the dead hand system in a second, but I just want to go back on that point, because any conversation you have with any military officer or someone from the national security industries and community, right, they will always look at you and tell you that if you're able to sprinkle AI and machine learning ML over the top of something, the problem will be cured. Except in the field of nuclear command and control, no one, and I mean no one that I've spoken to, is ever saying that we would put this in the hands. You put hypersonics in the hands of AI, you can have human out of the loop decision making and all that stuff, but absolutely no way in the field of nuclear command and control, nuclear weapons. And I think that is a sign of, in a way, the maturity of the debate in nuclear weapons theory, right? That no one is just going, yeah, it'll solve our problems. I do, however, wonder if you're putting the sensing part into nuclear C2, how much of that ML to do with layering and fusing of sensors to provide you with more definition and target data over a single event, heat blooms, for example, is going to come into it. And I see that potentially as the area where, this is where it starts to, AI and ML start to leach in to the nuclear world much more. Do you think so?
No, you're absolutely right. So what you're talking about is a signal detection use case. And there's actually another use case that I'll talk about as well, where we're already using these tools. But let's just take signal detection, because you're absolutely right. When you're proliferating the ISR capabilities that I talked about earlier, right? Space-based assets, aerial assets, radar-based assets like X-band radar systems. They look like oil rigs with a massive globe tent on them. What we're doing is we're fusing different data sources together that used to require having a single operator that was really well versed in kind of reading radar signatures, reading hyperspectral imagery, reading SAR. And so what you would have is, right, you'd have individual operator, and then they would report up to their boss, and their boss might be responsible for 2 or 3 data streams. And then they would talk to their boss. And then eventually you would get a picture as you moved up the chain till you get to the president or the prime minister. Right. And then it goes back down and the prime minister decides what to do, talking to various different people, and then back out to the submarine or bomber pilot, et cetera. And so one of the things that signal detection tools buy you is you're able to fuse all of those systems together and get them on a single terminal where one operator can report directly into, right, the decision-making process and potentially save a lot of time. And that's something that actually is one of the things that continually militaries around the world are trying to do. They're trying to decrease the amount of time that it takes for them to get a positive inference and then get that to the decision maker, because you're talking about time horizons for the nuclear case that are on the order of 15 to 25 minutes, depending on kind of what you're talking about. And so anything that you can do to take a human out of that network and allow them to hop over, all to the good. Now, of course, one of the things that's happening when you're moving up the bureaucratic chain is you're getting somebody asking the question, well, really? Like, is this really what we think's happening? And so one of the things you worry about, even in the early warning use case where you're using these signal detection tools, is that you're losing a check on, does this sound right? Does this not sound right? There's a very famous incident, it's a Netflix documentary, among other things, right? The Petrov incident, where you have a Soviet radar officer who looks at the signatures on his screen and says, that's not what I think or an American attack on the Soviet Union would look like. I'm not going to pass this up the chain. And so all the human beings that you're losing as you're taking away individual radar operator, individual, right, space-based sensor operator, you're kind of losing that check. But you are getting that efficiency, if you will, to use the term that we were using before, in terms of I get some of that time back. Of course, one of the other things to bear in mind is that as you proliferate the number of sensors, eventually you're just going to create so many data points, there's no way that any human's actually going to be able to sift through them. So that's the other argument for kind of using some of these signal detection tools. The way that the Americans thus far have got around it is by leveraging what's called dual phenomenology. So I want 2 entirely separate sensor assets, both of which point to nuclear use by an adversary in order to make a determination to go. But of course, think about what the United States has at its disposal in terms of ISR and compare that to what the North Koreans might have, right? Or even what the Chinese might have. And that's a really interesting question. We worry a lot about the vulnerabilities that we have in the space domain. And that's because it's a fairly juicy target for an adversary because we rely on it so heavily for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, but also communications in a way that Russia does not, China does not. So as such, it's a pretty decent target for them because of it's an asymmetrical vulnerability on our end. So I think you'll see it there. The other use case as well is anomaly detection. So this is left of launch concerns. So is an adversary doing something strange around its nuclear sites that might make you believe that they're getting ready to do something kinetic? That's something that, particularly in the rogue state case, you might want to be looking at. So those are tools as well. Although, of course, again, the data problem's significant there because if I had told you that I had an anomaly detection algorithm in the run up to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, it would have told you like, well, nuclear exercises are normal. They never lead to escalation. And here's an example, right? This is the black swan. And so I think you have to remember what the AI tools are actually buying you. They're buying you speed, right? In terms of getting a decision quickly. They're buying you efficiency in terms of being able to munge all of these systems together. And occasionally they're buying you emergent properties. If that's not what you want, you don't want to deploy AI. But those are the two places where we see it. But it very much is in that early warning lane, not in the command and control lane. Because to some extent, you want to make sure that you kind of have humans being a check on what it is that you think is happening in the real world and also what you want to do in response.
Listen, that was beautifully explained. And I'm hoping you can do the same for listeners who may not be familiar with something that you've used a couple of times and is peculiar to nuclear C2, I think, which is the dead hand system.
Yeah, so most recently it made the news because when Vladimir Putin made a speech a few years ago, he included a dead hand, actually nuclear torpedo, the Poseidon system, inside of the long list of the shopping list of Russian nuclear things. And so it kind of came up in the news again. The theory of having a dead hand is that should your leadership be decapitated, you wanted to assure that second strike stability that we talked about at the very beginning of the podcast. And so the Soviets had a version of this system during the Cold War called Perimeter that could be turned on and off in theory and operate in that way such that if the Kremlin were to disappear, the Americans can be assured that there would be a nuclear launch in response. There are various conversations. I mean, there are a couple of scholars who do think that investing in a dead hand's a good idea. In theory, it gives you quote unquote perfect deterrence because the Russians' dead hand system or the Chinese dead hand system is geared up against the American dead hand system. And so you have that first and second strike stability dealt with because you don't have to worry about whether, if DC's hit, who ultimately gets the command. Annie Jacobson has a book that's relatively new called Nuclear War: A Scenario. That's a really good book for seeing where you get some of these problems in terms of a lack of leadership, because you are, in all countries that have nuclear weapons, effectively the decision-making power is endowed inside of the leader of the country. And so if you don't have that survivable chain of command, you have a problem. There's foibles in that book, but in terms of that piece of it, I think that that's a really good place to go and look. And so there's that theory. I think what worries me about dead hand systems is the capacity for accidents in particular. So when we're thinking about systems engineering on any system, but particularly nuclear systems, there's a probability of failure associated with almost any particular capability or technological widget that we ever build. And so one of the real challenges with nuclear command and control writ large is that it needs to be responsive to what's called the always never dilemma. So you always want this network and these capabilities to work when called upon. You never want them to go off unless they actually have the real order that says you need to go now. And that's a really hard technical challenge. It's a really hard institutional challenge. And some argue that it's only by luck that we've managed to go 70 years with this capability and never having actually used it. But certainly dead hand systems, I think, move us towards being a little bit more dangerous. But again, this is all a matter of religion because there's no way to kind of empirically test that particular theory.
It is an amazing part of political science, isn't there? Because there's a huge amount of conjecture and there's very little data to base it on. Even former leaders, national leaders, are loath, in fact, so rarely comment on nuclear C2 that it doesn't really add to any of our corporate knowledge and wisdom in terms of how we judge these things in the future. And because it comes down to so much sort of history, strategic empathy, understanding cultures, it's really difficult for individual leaders to get hold of it. I don't know if you think, I guess this is a little bit out there. We've talked about the sort of nuclear C2 as a sort of theoretical concept. We've talked about it sort of military element. We've talked about it technologically. In terms of a human concept, the person at the top, I mean, former prime ministers in the UK have often written in their memoirs that it was the most grounding thing they ever did was to write the letters to on-patrol captains. We don't really prepare leaders for this very well. There might be a businessman, there might be a through and through politician who's never touched defence before. Suddenly they sit down in the office with frightening regularity, different prime ministers coming in the UK. But, we don't give them much preparation for this. Is there an argument that either a lack of preparation or more preparation is valuable in terms of strategic stability in nuclear C2?
Well, I'm always going to say yes. I think we spend a lot of time trying to make the argument to senior leaders in government that they need to take the time out of their incredibly busy schedules where they have to worry about everything, right? They have to worry about inflation, pandemics, nuclear war is just a piece of their portfolio. Of course, I'm biased. I would argue a very important piece of their portfolio, but getting senior leaders from government in the room for, let's say, 3-4 hours to actually war game or tabletop exercise these types of scenarios that we really are worried about is incredibly hard to do. And one of the places in the United States where we try to make it happen is during the transitions. So one of the things historically that's happened, right, particularly when you're moving between Democratic and Republican administrations or vice versa, is you want to take the secretary level cabinet and actually run them through usually a security oriented, not necessarily just nuclear, but you want to kind of prepare them for these types of scenarios. And all of the memoirs that we read in this space suggest that those exercises are incredibly useful. Condoleezza Rice, who was the Secretary of State under Bush, the National Security Advisor under Bush 2, that is, had the apocryphal quote of during 9/11, because of the tabletop exercise that she had taken part in during the transition, she knew who it was that she was going to be speaking with. She knew what types of information was germane to the response. She knew where she would be taken. And all of that made it much easier for her to respond and act during that crisis. Not because they'd actually appropriately created a scenario around, right, the hijacking of a series of airliners, but rather because just the broad, like, you are inside of a crisis environment, you need to be prepared. But in the United States, we have, right, 2 and a bit months to get the next cabinet ready to go. Inside of the United Kingdom, I was actually in Whitehall on July 4th when you had the most recent election. And, Rishi was there in the morning and then Keir Starmer was there in the evening. And so, there is no transition. One of the really interesting historical vagaries of the letters of last resort, which is what you're describing, the prime minister's writing there, is that occasionally you'll have prime ministerships like Liz Truss's that are so short that I'm not entirely sure that her letter of last resort ever actually made it onto the submarine. And so for a period of time, the new prime minister's Navy is operating with the former prime minister's letters, which is kind of really interesting as you think about what's going in and out. But no, it is the case that, you want to make sure that people are prepared. I did my MPhil at Oxford at St. Anthony's, and certainly I think one of the things that was nice, given the large number of people that are taking PPE at Oxford and Cambridge and then going off into working in politics, I think some of them do end up getting captured by programs like Rob Johnson's at Oxford. And so they might at least take a seminar or at least go to an event at All Souls College, right, focused on military affairs. And so maybe there's that piece of it. But it's very difficult because, like you said before, it's very easy for me as a scholar to say, hey, pay more attention for this. And like you said before, scholars often don't think about, right, like the resources piece of it. You're absolutely right. We generally don't think about like dollars, right, or pounds and how much ought to be spent. We just say, this is really important. Figure it out. And so we need to do a much better job when we think about that type of thing and understand where the policymaker actually is living. But certainly, I think that in the new geopolitical environment in which we find ourselves, I think there's a good argument that folks in MOD, folks in DOD need to really be working to make sure that the political class understand these risks and are prepared to deal with them both over the short term in a crisis, but over the long term as well in terms of thinking about procurement. I asked my students how much money they think goes from the DoD's budget into nuclear weapons, and they always wildly over-exaggerate the number. They think it's like 50% because nuclear weapons are so important and they have existential consequences, right? The real number is between 6 and 10%. So they're an order of magnitude off. And so I think that we'll need to do a better job of communicating and bringing them into these conversations.
Andrew, brilliant. Thank you so much for sparing the time and for making what's a quite difficult and niche topic so accessible for the audience. And we're going to link some of Andrew's work into the podcast notes of the show, and it's definitely worth reading. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR Citaware suite.
We hope you enjoy the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do subscribe. Leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us to reach new audiences and spread the word. The episode is produced by ReliusThinking.com as a show for the Waiver Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.